right, thank you all so much for being here tonight. So I'm going to read two passages from my new book, and I want to just give you a little bit of background about it because it's not from the beginning of the book. So my book is this one, Landfalls, and it's a fictional account of the La Pérouse expedition, which was an 18th century voyage of exploration that left France and attempted, but did not succeed in, circumnavigating the world. So there are two passages from chapter something late in the book that I'm going to read, and it takes place in Macau, at the time, Portuguese settlement in South China. And in this chapter, 4 scientists from the 2 ships that made up this expedition rent a house in Macau and leave the ships and hang out there. And one of the things they discover when they rent this house is there's a woman who comes with this house. And this apparently did happen back in the 18th century. You know, the British East India Company or such people would have these houses for their employees there, and there would sometimes be a woman installed in the house to service the man who lived in the house. So they find a woman installed there. She causes a little bit of tension between them. But then the scientists get in trouble because they don't have permission to be away from the ships, and they haven't told their respective captains where they are. So they get arrested, and they have to spend 24 hours back on their respective ships. So the first scene shows the point of view character, who was one of the scientists. His name was Lamartiniere, occupying himself during these 24 hours. And the second scene will be when he goes back to Macau once he's released from his arrest, his temporary imprisonment. And for various reasons that I will not go into, he ends up going back to that house alone. So this is the first scene. He lit a candle and turned to the specimens on his desk. He was primarily a botanist, but tiny animals interested him too, and he was still amazed by what he'd discovered on the head of a sunfish the men had caught in Alaska. A keen-eyed sailor had brought it to him. "I saved this from the stew pot, sir," he said, when I noticed all the worms on it. Sure enough, the head was like a cabinet of curiosities, parasitized by several distinct organisms on and around its gills. The specimens he had extracted were now suspended in 5 alcohol-filled vials, secured in a wooden box made specially for the purpose. He opened the box and slid out one vial and fumbled around himself for a moment in search of his pocket microscope, before remembering that he'd left it in the house in Macau. Sighing, he held the vial between himself and the candle flame and squinted to see the nearly transparent specimens preserved within. The sailor who'd saved the fish had called the creatures worms, and indeed most naturalists did too, but Lamartiniere thought they had more in common with insects. To the naked eye, the tiny filaments that protruded from the fish's head and now floated in the vial looked wormy enough, but with a microscope one could clearly see that they had leg-like appendages. He'd consulted Linnaeus and felt pretty certain they were parasitic varieties of Pennatula. Some of the creatures were buried so deeply and firmly in their host's body that he had trouble extracting them. At least one he'd unwittingly beheaded. It was hard to imagine how the soft-bodied creatures had burrowed their way through the fish's scales. Could they have found their hosts early, he wondered, while in some tinier, sharper, juvenile state, then remained headfirst in the fish's body, lodged and fed forever therein, as their heads enlarged and their bodies softened and elongated behind them. They also appeared to have eyes, a single compound structure in the middle of their heads, though they hardly had need of them. What a strange life, he thought, with one's head entirely buried in the relative safety of ever-present nutrition, while one's back end lay exposed to whatever might befall in the great oceans, including, at the end, the naturalist's indelicate tweezers dragging one out from dark sustenance into light and death. So the next day he's allowed to go back to Macau. He enters the house and he's alone there. Upstairs, he was pleased to find his room aired out and fresh water in the ewer next to the basin, and even more pleased to find his belongings exactly as he'd left them. His clothes in the massive mahogany wardrobe, his books dusted but otherwise untouched, his pocket microscope undisturbed in its box on the bedside table. Eager to change into fresh clothes, he removed his hat and wig, then his coat and waistcoat, and was undoing his cravat when he heard a hissed conversation outside his room, and opening the door, found Sophie holding a tea tray and the watchman pushing her forward. Sophie! He had all but forgotten her. She stood before him now in all her languid beauty, swaying slightly, eyes downcast, her hair carelessly piled up on her head and half spilling down her neck. She seemed to be wearing only a white silk petticoat, the gauzy fichu thrown over her shoulders quite insufficient to complete the dress. Mesmerized by this vision of alluring dishabille, and keenly aware of his own state of partial undress, Lamartiniere realized that the old watchman, understanding perfectly that Lamartiniere would be alone the rest of the day, was offering the amenities of the house accordingly. The old man barked something in Chinese and poked Sophie in the back. She took a step into the room, but was so unsteady that Lamartiniere rushed forward to relieve her of the tea tray. Setting the tray down on a small walnut table, he led Sophie to the leather-upholstered chair next to it. She fell into it like a dead weight. "What's wrong with her?" Lamartiniere demanded. "Sophie, little sleepy," the watchman said. "She's not sleepy," Lamartiniere said. He leaned over the chair and tipped her head back. "Sophie, open your eyes." She complied, smiling absently at the sight of his face over hers. Her eyes were so dark it was hard to make out the pupils, but then he saw them, a black pencil dot in the center of each iris. He took a handful of her hair and sniffed it. "She's been smoking opium," he said, recognizing its sweet pungency. "No, no, only sleepy," the watchman repeated, then bowed his way out of the room, winking once before shutting the door. Lamartiniere regarded the woman slouched in the chair before him and wavered between anger, repulsion, and lust. What had the watchman been thinking, bringing her to him in this state? It was a terrible imposition, yet her presence also felt like a gift, some recompense for all the vexations he had suffered. His fingers were still in her hair, and he could see the slow rise and fall of her breasts beneath the fabric of her shift. The slow breathing, another sign of intoxication, but a bewitching one. He sat on the floor next to her and laid his head in her lap, his heart pounding, in sharp contrast to her own slowed pulse. He took her wrist to check, unable to stop acting the part of a medically trained man, despite the roar of desire coursing through his body. He had not touched a woman in 2 years. Some of the men had consorted with women in Chile and Alaska, but he had not, constrained by what exactly? His own reputation for fussy rectitude, he suspected. He didn't have the resourcefulness to seek out such enticements himself, and had never been offered any because his shipmates assumed he would disapprove. They were right. He did disapprove. He disapproved mightily, even as he allowed one hand to slide down the length of Sophie's leg, caressing it through the silk, then slipping under the skirt and moving back up, this time along the stockinged leg itself, past the garter, then along her bare thigh, its warmth and softness overwhelming compunction. When he tried to put his hand between her legs, she stirred and opened her eyes, looking down at him without recognition, alarm, or pleasure. He gazed into her dark eyes with their opium-pinched pupils and thought of the purposeless eyes of the peninsula in their vials aboard the ship. Perhaps they needed their eyes only long enough to identify their host. He slipped his other hand under the skirt and gently pried her legs apart. She shut her eyes again and offered no resistance. Hosts rarely knew when they were being encroached upon, of course. It was a linchpin of the parasitic relationship. His breath caught in his throat when his fingertips reached the warm, furred center of her. He raised himself to his knees, the better to move himself over her, and pillowed his face against her breasts, still thinking, indeed unable to stop thinking, of the peninsula and his hypothesis that they burrowed into their hosts early on and grew once inside. But now he found his fingers pressing into dry, unyielding flesh, another symptom of opium use, lack of sexual response. But could one really call it that if the non-responsive party seemed unaware of the ministrations being applied? He felt himself deflating, body and mind, and tried to rally himself to the task. Reaching behind Sophie, he pulled her forward in the chair, then raised her skirts, the better to see and smell and taste her. A little moisture applied to the right place and he would be able to see it through. But now his head filled with the memory of the difficulty he'd had removing the parasites from the sunfish, how he'd accidentally beheaded one of them, extracting its back end while leaving the tip buried in the flesh, and he drew back with a groan of repugnance and defeat. The sound, and perhaps the suddenly cooler air around her, roused Sophie from her torpor. "So nice," she said breathily while attempting to straighten her petticoat. The falseness of the sentiment, and her apparent ignorance of what had just happened, or not happened, mortified La Martiniere almost as much as the failure itself, and elicited another groan from him. "I like too," she said, her words slow and slurred, deepening his misery. She tried to sit up. "I pour you tea." La Martiniere scrambled up from the floor. "No," he said, placing his hand on the porcelain teapot and wincing at the heat. "You're in no condition to handle hot water. I'll pour it." Stilling his guilty hands by force of will, he poured out a cup of the steaming green liquid. He blew across its surface and brought it to her lips. "Sophie, you must stop using opium," he said. Thank you.